Okay, we're starting Romanticism, 1820 to about 1900, although those dates can be a little fluid. And this starts on page 257 for you in your textbook. All right, so we're going to go over basic information here, the build up to Romanticism as a whole as an artistic movement, but then more specifically, Romanticism as a musical movement. So in Romanticism, the whole focus is basically emotion, imagination, and individuality. It's to rebel against what we saw in the classical period, especially neoclassicism, rebelling against a lot of those Greek ideas, those Greek and Roman ideas, and it's supposed to be an expression of freedom, or the freedom to express, I guess you could say. In Romanticism, no matter if you're looking at literature, art, music, whatever, these people wanted to basically sum up the entire human experience into one moment, or one concept, one idea. And so that's a tall order for sure. But with that, you get a lot of drama, some very intense music and art. There's going to be an international influence in Romanticism, and you're going to try to, again, encompass all of the arts. So we've seen areas where artistic movements and literature movements kind of impact the musical movements. Here, they're going to interconnect or lock together. They really are very much connected. And this is all subjective. So what one person interprets is just as valid as what another person would interpret when we're thinking about the emotional content or maybe the purpose or inspiration behind a piece of music. This is a quote from William Wordsworth, a Romantic poet. He says that all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and it's the idea of spontaneous overflow that will carry over to music in particular. This music is supposed to be kind of autobiographical, so about that composer's own life. Authors want to project their own personalities into their compositions, writing, art, whatever. Now there is an element of fantasy in a lot of this romantic movement. And so fantasy, we're talking about the realm of the unconscious, the irrational, in the realm of dreams. Now it's also important that psychology didn't exist until about the latter half of the Romantic period, but already we see the trend towards moving towards psychology, and then definitely after psychology is kind of invented, how that new science will influence composers' output. If we're thinking of literary complements to this idea of fantasy within Romanticism, you could look at The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Hopefully you have read one of those, or maybe have seen a movie. The next is the idea of chivalric romance. So first off, the whole question of why is the Romantic period called romantic? Do we mean lovey-dovey? Not really. The term romance comes from a specific genre from the Middle Ages, and during the Romantic period, within the 1800s, people started to look back towards the Middle Ages. And so what is a chivalric romance? So these are stories about knights, dragons, and princesses in a tower. So people are looking at those ancient stories and drawing inspiration from them. A lot of those stories kind of passed down in folk ballads, and so when people started to look at those from in the 1800s, they kind of adopted this term and became known as the Romantics. This is also a revival of the Gothic style, particularly in architecture, so Gothic architecture made a comeback. Literature that reflects the idea of the chivalric romance and the parallels therein would be Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott and The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. Side note, even though Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame is amazing, you should definitely watch it if you haven't, it takes a lot of liberties with Victor Hugo's original. But it still has that idea of Middle Ages and some chivalric romance ideas. Next is nature. So a lot of romantics draw a lot of inspiration from nature, and we see how they start to view this physical world as a representation or a mirror to the human condition. So not only could you go out in nature, maybe go camping for a weekend and draw consolation to the human heart, like just recharge basically, it can mirror what a lot of people see in their own lives. So take this picture for example. At first glance, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful landscape. You've got mountains in the back, this nice little stream, this forest, these pretty clouds. But as you start to look at it, you start to notice that it's not perfect. There are lots of shadows here. You don't know if there are bears in the woods. As you get closer, it looks like there may be rocks within this waterfall, this stream here, so that could be dangerous. And even the forest itself looks unkempt. It's not manicured. So it's difficult. And just like people, we put a veneer out that we are perfect or whatever, but on the inside we know that we're not. Nature starts to, or people start to see that reflected in nature. It's beautiful, but also dangerous. And finally, looking at the influence of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution starts to happen during this Romantic period. It brings about tons of socio and economic changes. So social and economic changes, the rise of the middle class gets bigger. And so people start to take into consideration what the working class and the poor want and need in society. So if you're thinking of a literary parallel here, anything by Charles Dickens would fit the bill. So anything like Oliver Twist or Great Expectations or A Christmas Carol, all of those would fit into this concept of the Industrial Revolution and its impact on not just society, but also on literature and art. Okay, looking at Romanticism in music, looking in chapter 1, this is page 261 in your textbook. First of all, there are lots of composers this unit, and there's no way around it. There are just lots of different people. So some of the composers that we will look at, this is non-exhaustive, would be Schubert, Mr. and Mrs. Schumann, Chopin, Liszt, Mendelssohn, Felix and his sister Fanny, Berlioz and Tchaikovsky, and several others. This is actually the Mendelssohn siblings. Don't they look adorable? So an overview of what you're going to see here. People are still using the classical era forms, so those are kind of the blueprint, but on top of that, people want to heighten the emotional intensity that Mozart started. And a lot of the music becomes expressive, so expressing feelings, and it's song-like. You can almost sing along with it. Do note that all of this is in italics, so it must be important. So looking at how the classical era compares to the Romantic era. So in the classical period, composers are starting to experiment or dabble in terms of range, so the highest note to the lowest note, tone color, and dynamics. The harmony is going to be pretty stable. There are moments of instability, particularly in development sections of sonata form, but otherwise you can say that the harmony stays relatively stable. And forms in general, when we're thinking about composition, they're going to stay balanced. Themes are going to be balanced, and that is part of the aesthetic for the classical period. Versus in Romanticism, and sorry, my face is covering some of this. Oops. Goodness gracious. There we go. So, in Romantic period, there are very big differences, huge range, a lot of playing with tone color, much more than what we saw in the classical period, and dynamic range will be even broader. The harmony is going to be basically unstable. That's the big takeaway there. And in terms of balance, everybody's very different in the Romantic period. There are lots of little subcategories, and so you can't really make a generalization on whether or not the themes and the overall structure is going to be balanced or not. Characteristics here. I'm going to move my face over here. Okay, so characteristics of Romantic music. There's going to be a lot of individuality when it comes to style. Again, lots of different subcategories. There is an unprecedented emphasis on self-expression and individuality. Therefore, you're going to have a lot of small differences across the board when it comes to composers, and that's why it's so hard to make generalizations. It's easy However, because everybody is trying to sound different from one another, it's much easier to identify different composers. Now, there is kind of this intent, I guess you could say, to express pretty much all of your feelings all at once, all the time. It's very emotional. Some of the emotional qualities that the music may take on would be anything like flamboyance, melancholy, rapture, longing, very big words, very huge emotions, things that honestly are so big it's hard to fit into something artistic or some kind of anything concrete, and yet that's the goal of this music. Furthermore, people loved nature scenes and pastoral elements, and that was again to reflect the landscape of the human condition. All right, moving to nationalism. Nationalism is briefly mentioned on page 262. We're just going through an overview at this point. But nationalism is an important political movement in the 19th century. So 19th century is the 1800s. You can roughly describe this or define this as a pride for one's country and people, and it's also meant to help define a nation. During the 1800s, lots of countries in Europe were trying to regroup with the Napoleonic Wars and everything, so borders were being redrawn, and people had to define themselves as a country or a nation or a group of people, and that brings about nationalism. Do pay special attention that some of the text is italicized, so it's probably important. But nationalism in music takes on a slightly different role. Composers are trying to deliberately create music with a specific national identity, and they can do this by using folk songs from that area, dances, legends, even language in the history of their homeland. So it can be in support of a country, or it can also be kind of a protest. And we're going to explore how both of those avenues were used. In contrast, there is another movement called exoticism. And this is similar but different from nationalism. Nationalism is trying to bring people together. That's the main goal. Exoticism is more of an interest. It's a fascination with the national identity of other cultures and foreign lands. So basically it's just people being curious and discovering new types of music, new sounds, and trying to evoke those sounds. We see this a lot with some opera. If we look at Puccini's opera Madame Butterfly, that is influenced by Asian sounds. Madame Butterfly takes place in Japan. And then you also see this in Bizet's opera Carmen. So Bizet is French. This is a French opera. However, it is set in Spain, and so the music tries to take on a Spanish identity, I guess. Program music. This is still on page 262. It is an instrumental music that is associated with a story, poem, idea, or scene. So do take special note. This is instrumental music. There's no words along with this unless you have a program. So how do you explain that it's supposed to tell a story? Maybe the title will give it away, or you can have a program, which is basically little notes or explanatory comments that you get, a sheet of paper, as you go into the concert. So program music can represent emotions, characters, a story, and it can also evoke sounds of nature or maybe motion or a landscape. We will talk about how that works and what that looks like later on. But a good example of that would be the Symphonie Fantastique by Berlioz. We'll take a look at this later in the unit. But program music is one of the areas where we see the arts come together and lock together. So it's a big mixture of multiple art forms, especially music and literature. Now, tone color. Tone color is going to be rich, a lot of beautiful, lush sounds, but the timbre, that tone color, is meant to create different moods and atmospheres. This is one of the ways composers start to make program music more evocative, so they're trying to be more specific in evoking certain emotions or atmospheres. So it's super important in the Romantic period. Composers also wanted to blend instruments in a way to create new sounds. So just being creative with the tone color that you can create. The orchestra. So the orchestra keeps growing at this point. At the beginning of the Romantic era, it's going to be pretty similar to what you had in the Classical period, where you would have 20 to 60 players in an orchestra. By the end of the Romantic era, by the time you get to about 1900, the orchestra is well over 100 players. And as the orchestra grows, that reflects the changing needs of the composer. So composers want to push the envelope more and more as we go along here. Brass, woodwind, and percussion instruments are more active in the orchestra. The brass section increases, so the sound that you get, the power from the orchestra increases. And brass instruments were better made. Their construction was evolving, and so it was easier to play for a brass instrumentalist. Okay, I'm going to move my face back over here. Okay, so woodwinds are going to be used a lot for tone color. So you get new instruments like piccolo, English horn, bass clarinet, and contrabassoon. Kind of strange instruments or more niche instruments. But overall, the woodwind instruments were being constructed in a better way, and just like the brass, it was easier for them to play. Percussion is going to grow as well. You're going to use new instruments like cymbals, triangle, and harp. Instrumentalists are going to also, across the board, are going to be asked to play their instruments in new ways. So, for an example, a flute, which usually plays in a higher register, may be asked to play at their lowest notes, and it kind of has this kind of spooky feel to it. Violinist, instead of playing with the hair side of the bow, may be asked to play with the wood side of the bow, and that's going to create a different sound too. The piano is the favorite instrument of the Romantic era. People were like, yes, pianos, yes. But so a lot of music is being written for it. 1820 to 30, there's a lot of improved construction to the piano, so it's stronger and people are starting to experiment with what all they can do. The frame of the piano is going to be cast iron, so it holds the strings under greater tension. The hammers that will hit the strings as you play the different keys, they're going to be covered with felt, so it protects the strings. The range of the keyboard is extended, and you get a damper pedal, so you get small but significant changes here. All around, it's a stronger instrument. Okay, there we go, sorry. Looking at, nope, that's still the wrong one, sorry. Colorful harmony. So this is page 263. So what we're talking about with colorful harmony is basically chromatic harmony. It is the use of chords containing tones that aren't found in the major or minor scale, the prevailing major or minor scale. So this goes back into the chromatic scale, basically. So tones that you find in the chromatic scale, that 12-note scale, can be borrowed and used in a major or minor scale. You can build chords off of these chromatic notes, and they basically will add different colors in motion into the music. The music is going to be dissonant, so a little bit more crunchy. The harmony is going to be unstable, okay, especially if you use these chromatic chords more frequently. And the whole purpose of these chromatic scale or chromatic harmonies would basically be to delay the resolution and create more tension and mystery. So it's just making things more dramatic overall. In chromatic harmony, you're going to hear lots of modulations, and that makes the tonic, that home key, your predominant key, less clear. And the whole focus is, again, the instability of harmony, which will bring about more drama. So talking about expanding the range of dynamics, pitch, and tempo. So there are sharp contrasts in dynamics. We're thinking about the classical period, we're going from super loud to super soft. In the Romantic period, that's even bigger. It's like mega loud to mega soft. So things, again, are getting more dramatic. There are frequent crescendos and decrescendos. So a crescendo is to gradually get louder, the decrescendos to gradually get softer. Extreme highs and lows in range, much more than what you saw in the classical period. Lots of fluctuations in tempo, so it's not going to stay that steady beat the entire time. With that, you have rubato. This is a term that basically means you slightly hold back or slightly press forward in terms of the tempo. That is for the expression. So you're trying to make this more emotional, more expression-filled, I guess you could say. And it's basically the conductor's choice or the performer's choice how you go about that. And then looking at the form of miniature and monumental works. So this isn't necessarily a form, but more of a dichotomy within the time period. There are miniature forms, which are usually piano pieces or art songs. It's a piece of music that lasts only a few minutes, and it's meant for an intimate home setting. So as you can see, this is Schubert. He is playing at the piano. People are at home. They look like they're having fun. They're all friends. He is likely playing a miniature form, a piano piece. Versus a monumental form, which, oops. Goodness gracious. Okay, so versus the monumental form, which will have many performers and could last several hours. So maybe an opera or a symphony, anything that's meant for a large concert hall. That's a monumental form. So looking at these longer works, so anything like a symphony starts to get longer and longer. So a 45-minute symphony rather than the 25-minute symphony we saw in the classical period. There are going to be new techniques to unify a work because these works are getting so huge. You may have recurring themes, quotes from a previous section, transitional passages, etc. You could also have thematic transformation. So when a melody returns in a later movement or section of a romantic work, that theme could be transformed in terms of character, dynamics, orchestration, rhythm. Either way, I don't want to say it's too similar to theme and variations, but it's kind of a descendant from that idea. You're taking a theme and infusing it in this large work every so often, just so you, the audience member, can understand that this is all meant to be one cohesive piece. And that's it for Chapter 1. It's a lot of stuff, but I will pick back up in the next video.